Welcome back, everybody. We are doing the WaffleBox thing. We have created our awesome modal dialogs at this point. They are blurrable. We've done all of our CSS to make sure they look great on a wide variety of devices, and it is all looking pretty darn good at this point. In this lesson, we're going to focus on creating a new feature within our toggle script that was recently refactored. We're going to update it to allow for what we could call a dismiss click. As I demonstrated at the very end of the last lesson, there's going to be an issue with trying to wire up, for example, a cancel button or like a close button. If we were to put like a little X at the top right of this dialog, we're going to have an issue with tying it to the same toggle functionality as our subscribe button, which is behind the scenes, is this button right here. And the reason being is because we haven't really set up our script to say whenever you toggle something, go out and update all of the buttons that are tied to the same thing. That could certainly be one approach, is that you could support the idea of having multiple toggle buttons applied to the same toggle target, but we haven't built our script in that way. It's always set up to, for example, in toggle.js, it's set up to get the button, right? It's getting a single button on every click and it's toggling that button. We just haven't set it up to do that pattern of let's do multiple toggle buttons. And I don't think we need to. It's not really necessary, because by making a very simple addition to our toggle script, we can support this idea of having other dismiss clicks or dismissible buttons, if you will, within the toggle container itself that will allow us to very easily dismiss this dialog. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. Let's add some HTML, first of all, to our dialog that we added and created in the last lesson. And let's add a close button to our modal dialog title to allow us to close it whenever you click on an X. And so this will look like this. Right after our H3, we'll do button.close. We'll give it a class of close so that maybe we can do some CSS stuff with that later. And then we will do span aria hidden equals true, and then we'll put like a times symbol in there, so it'll just be like an X, and then we'll have span.sr only, so that'll be close dialog. So that'll be the accessible description of this button, and you'll see all we did is just add an X button, like you can see there. And now that we've added this, let's go into our modal.sass and we'll create a close button style, if you will, so that we can change the appearances of this, maybe put it at the top right, which is kind of typical for a close button, and just make it look a bit better. So let's go down to the bottom here and we'll add a section for close button, and we'll say .close. Whenever you have that class, let's set background first of all to transparent, and color will be medium, like so. And then we'll need to override the hover color. So let's do hover and focus, background color. Let's actually add a little bit of a hover color. So we'll do like a transparent color, so like 5%. So when you hover over it, just a little bit of a highlight there. Let's take off our box shadow because there's a little bit of a bottom shadow. So box shadow will be none on that element. So that's looking better. So you see we just get a little bit of a hover there. Want to bump up the font size so it's bigger. Let's, instead of, see how it's kind of a rectangular button, let's actually round that off, and let's say height is 40 pixels, width is 40 pixels, line height is 40 pixels, so that it's all the same height. And then we'll need to take off the padding because it's kind of off center there. There we go. So we have a nice square button, and we can set border radius to 50% to make it round. So that's looking pretty good. And let's take off the text shadow as well. So there's a little bit of a text shadow there, and that's looking pretty good. So let me sort all these properties here. And the next thing we want to do is make sure this is positioned at the top right here. So what we'll have to do is probably on the modal dialog, let's add a position relative. So we're going to position it relative to the dialog itself. And then the close button will be position absolute, top 10 pixels, right 10 pixels, something like that. And then that moves it up here, and that's pretty good, right? So we just added like a little close button at the top right there so people can come up here and click on close. Doesn't currently do anything, but that's normally something I would come to expect from a dialog. I would probably also, let's make sure that this title doesn't like you can see right there, that's an issue, how the close button is on top of this. So for the H3, we can add padding right 40 pixels. So that'll always give us enough room to do that. Just make sure that looks good here too. Yeah, so we'll take our modal dialog title. Let's just add that right above here. Modal dialog title padding right 40 pixels. So I actually added it to this element, but that works well too. So now when we go down to really small size, it's never going to appear on top of the text there. So that's looking better. Okay, and now that we've added some style and some CSS and HTML for our button here, what I basically want to do is I want to be able to click on any of these three buttons to essentially dismiss the modal, to kind of do a blur. The same thing we're doing on blur, I want to allow to occur on additional elements. So maybe, for example, we could just decide that on all three of these buttons, so I'll set up three cursors here, we could add a data dismiss attribute. And it doesn't have to have a value. It can just be a data dismiss, just like that. And then by the presence of that particular attribute, we can basically say, when you click on a data dismiss, then let's blur the active button. So sort of like we're doing a blur where we click away. Let's also update our blur method to check and see if you clicked on a data dismiss. And if you did, let's go ahead and do what you were going to do when you were doing a blur. I think that's a good opportunity to do that because that functionality and that listener is already in place. So that's this blur click method right here. And what we'll do first of all, because maybe we want dismiss to work without blur being enabled, is before we check to see if blur is not enabled, we can see, is this a dismiss click? And we can say const dismiss click. This will be a Boolean value, is equal to e.target.matches. And then we'll have a selector here that'll basically say, did you click on data dismiss or anything inside of data dismiss? So again, matches is going to return a Boolean. So it's going to be either true or false. And now we can say if you have not enabled blur and this is not a dismiss click, then go ahead and return. But if it is a dismiss click, so if this is truthy, it'll allow this blur functionality down here to actually continue to run. And so it's going to get all of the active buttons. It's going to go to each active button, and it's going to get the toggle container and check to see if the toggle container contains e.target. But if it's a dismiss click, then we don't need to do that, right? We can just simply do this right here. So we can say dismiss click, if dismiss click, then simply return this .toggle active button. So we don't need to go through this extra stuff because we know if we clicked on data dismiss, then yeah, let's blur. Let's blur this click, let's dismiss the active button. And I think just by doing that, we can now click on subscribe and click on close. And just like that, we are dismissing with all three of these buttons. So just a couple of lines of code here to add the ability to dismiss, but it's definitely something you're going to want to have with dialogs, especially to be able to do that. And it's probably a good idea to make this configurable as well. Like maybe you don't want to have the ability to dismiss, or maybe you want to change this attribute. So let's change this to a template string, and we'll replace data dismiss with this.config. I don't know, dismiss attr. So the dismiss attribute. And maybe we can also have a Boolean that defines whether or not you're allowed to dismiss. So this.config.dismiss. So if you've enabled dismiss and e.target.matches, then let's set this to truthy, which will allow it to dismiss the click. And so let's add these two options, this dismiss and this dismiss attribute option. So let's go up to the top here. We're now in alphabetical, so we'll put them right here. Dismiss is true by default, and dismiss attribute is data-dismiss by default. And then let's add both of these as well to our JS doc at the very bottom. So we will duplicate this. The dismiss is a Boolean which is just going to be enable dismiss buttons. And then the other one was a string called dismiss attribute, which is the dismiss button attribute name, like so. There we go. So we added all that good stuff. It's on by default because really you'd really have to like specifically add a data-dismiss button to your HTML in order to enable this. So really, I think it's okay to have this true by default, because if you don't want to use it, just don't add a data dismiss button and it's not going to be there. It won't be working. So I think that'll be fine to leave that on by default. And we now have some cool dismiss functionality that we've added to our modal dialog. In addition to adding dismiss, it's also a good idea. I think it's typically expected that within a dialog, you have the ability to hit the escape key on your keyboard to get out. So that's easy enough because we already have options for that. We can go ahead and on our modal dialog here, let's add key control is going to be true. And so that'll enable key control. And now when we tab to our subscribe button and open it, if we hit the escape key, it will actually disable that toggle. So that's great. That was easy. But also by enabling key control, you also by default, you enable the up and down key. So I'm doing the keyboard navigation, and that's kind of weird. Doesn't make as much sense inside of a modal dialog. So let's also do key navigation false to disable the navigation, because I think when we hit up and down, that should not necessarily navigate the different buttons in here. I can still use tab and shift tab to go back and forth there. But again, the escape key will now allow me to get out of our modal, which I think is working great now. Let me sort these options here just because I'm really particular. So that's all looking really good at this point. All right, so we have some pretty awesome modal dialogs. It actually doesn't work all that differently from our drop-down menus that we created previously. Just a little bit of a different consideration for accessibility and for the style, and especially that whole CSS overflow thing. But you can see here with a little bit of CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, we're able to create these really cool modal dialogs that are going to work really well across a wide variety of devices and allow us to create modal content that appears in our web application, which is great. Stay tuned. In the next lesson, we're going to take another look at modals and add one final improvement before we wrap these up.